Princess Anne had allegedly taken the extraordinary step of removing members of the Parker Bowles family from Royal Associated Records, and what made the move even more shocking was the reported approval behind it. King Charles, the husband of Queen Camilla, had apparently given his quiet blessing to a decision that directly affected her family. There was no dramatic announcement, no public confrontation, and no explanation from the palace. Just names disappearing, and a question that suddenly became impossible to ignore. Why would Charles allow his own wife's family to be pushed aside? Before we uncover what really happened behind palace walls, make sure you're subscribed. Royal stories rarely end where they begin, and this one may reveal far more about the future of the monarchy than anyone expected. The first sign that something extraordinary had happened inside the royal household was not a statement, a speech, or a confrontation. It was an absence. According to the premise of this story, several names connected to the Parker Bowles family quietly disappeared from Royal Associated Records. There was no announcement explaining why, no public warning, no carefully prepared statement from palace officials, just a change that, on the surface, could have looked almost insignificant. But inside the world of the monarchy, small changes can carry enormous meaning. Royal records, patronage arrangements, household lists, and official associations do not simply change themselves. Behind every alteration is a decision, and behind important decisions are people weighing reputation, loyalty, timing, and institutional risk. That is why the disappearance of these names allegedly attracted attention from royal observers who were accustomed to looking beyond what appeared in public. And the most striking part was not simply who had disappeared. It was who was reportedly behind the decision. Princess Anne has long been associated with a deeply practical idea of royal duty. The institution comes before personal comfort. Her own approach to royal life has been defined by independence, discipline, and an apparent reluctance to use the privileges surrounding her position for unnecessary advantage. Now that philosophy appeared to be colliding directly with the family of Queen Camilla. For Camilla, the implications were deeply personal. These were not strangers being removed from some distant royal circle. They were people connected to her own family, people whose familiarity with royal life had developed gradually over the years. And then came the detail that transformed an unusual administrative change into something far more serious. The decision was reportedly not made by Anne alone. King Charles had allegedly approved it. If that is true, then the real story is no longer simply about Princess Anne drawing a line around the monarchy. It is about a husband quietly allowing that line to be drawn around his wife's family. And that raises the question that would soon become impossible to avoid. What had happened inside the palace to make Charles believe this was necessary? For Camilla, the most painful part of the decision may not have been the disappearance of names from royal records. It was what those names represented. For years, her family had gradually become familiar with the world surrounding the monarchy, not as working royals, and not as people standing at the center of official ceremonies, but as relatives who had learned how to move through a world most outsiders could never enter. That distinction matters, because losing formal status is one thing. Losing the invisible privileges created by proximity is something entirely different. An invitation may arrive later than it once did. A familiar door may no longer open quite as easily. A conversation with palace staff may suddenly require another introduction. Nothing dramatic happens. Nobody announces that the relationship has changed. Yet the atmosphere begins to feel different. And for Camilla, that difference could not have been easy to ignore. She still had the title. She still had the king beside her. Her position within the monarchy had not suddenly disappeared. From the outside, everything could look perfectly stable. But inside the family, another question was beginning to emerge. Could Camilla's personal position remain secure while the institutional influence surrounding her family was deliberately reduced? That placed Charles in an unusually difficult position. He was not simply a king making an administrative decision. He was a husband whose wife could reasonably feel that her family had been singled out. Anne, meanwhile, appeared to be operating from a completely different emotional framework. She had spent decades presenting duty as something separate from personal preference. Her approach to royal life suggested that family connections should never automatically translate into institutional privilege. Then there was William. His vision of the monarchy had increasingly emphasized a smaller circle, clearer responsibilities, and less room for people whose connection to the crown came primarily through family. And Catherine represented another layer of change. The future generation was gradually becoming more central to the institution. For Camilla, that created an uncomfortable reality. The people around her were moving in different directions, and none of those directions necessarily led back toward protecting her family's position. Yet this still left the most important question unanswered. Why had Anne apparently waited so long to act? The answer may lie not in what happened that year, but in something Anne had believed for decades. To understand why Princess Anne could allegedly make such a decision, we have to look beyond the names that disappeared and toward the principle behind them. Anne has spent much of her life treating royal duty as something that must be earned rather than inherited simply through family connection. Perhaps the clearest example is the way she raised her own children. Peter Phillips and Zara Tyndall were not given working royal roles or placed on the royal payroll. Instead, they were expected to establish their own identities outside the institution. Their careers developed independently, and whatever recognition they achieved had to come from what they actually accomplished. For Anne, that distinction appears fundamental. Proximity to the crown should not automatically become a professional advantage. And that principle becomes particularly interesting when viewed alongside Camilla's family. After Charles and Camilla married, Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes gradually became familiar figures within the wider royal environment. They were not working royals. They did not stand at the center of official ceremonies. But their mother's position naturally gave them access to a world that most people could never enter. Over time, familiarity can become something more powerful than a formal title. It can become expectation. People know your name. Staff recognize you. Invitations become easier. Relationships develop quietly. Eventually, nobody has to explain why you belong in a particular room. And that may have been precisely what concerned Anne. There is no need to imagine her openly opposing Camilla. The more subtle interpretation is that Anne could accept Camilla as Charles's wife while remaining uncomfortable with the gradual expansion of her family's institutional proximity. That distinction changes the entire story. This may never have been about rejecting Camilla personally. It may have been about where Anne believed the boundary between family and institution should exist. And the striking part is that this attitude would not have appeared overnight. If Anne really held this view, she may have been watching the situation for years, saying very little and waiting for circumstances to change. Then, suddenly, those circumstances did change. The monarchy entered a period of renewed scrutiny. Questions about royal privilege became harder to ignore, and the pressure for a smaller, more disciplined institution intensified. Anne's opinion may not have changed at all. The opportunity to act on it had, and that is where the story becomes considerably more complicated, because the next move would reportedly bring Anne directly to Charles's door. The conversation between Anne and Charles, if the reported account is accurate, was never likely to be an ordinary family discussion. Anne was not approaching her brother as someone seeking permission for a personal grievance. She was presenting an argument about the institution they had both spent their lives serving. The question was simple on the surface. How much influence should a member of the wider royal family receive simply because of who they are related to? For Anne, the answer appeared increasingly clear. The monarchy could no longer afford blurred boundaries between personal relationships and institutional privilege, particularly while public scrutiny was intensifying. But Charles faced a problem that Anne did not. For him, this was not an abstract question about royal efficiency. It involved Camilla. Whatever his feelings toward the Parker Bowles family, they were connected to the woman he had spent decades defending, supporting, and ultimately marrying. Any decision affecting her children could easily become a personal wound inside the royal household. And yet rejecting Anne's argument carried its own risk. If Charles protected his wife's family simply because they were his wife's family, critics could interpret that as precisely the kind of preferential treatment the monarchy was increasingly trying to avoid. The timing made the dilemma even more difficult. The institution was already under pressure to demonstrate accountability. Questions surrounding other members of the wider royal circle had made every association more sensitive. The public was paying closer attention to who received access, influence, and recognition. Anne, therefore, had something powerful on her side. Principle. Charles had something equally powerful against him. Emotion. At some point, he had to decide which one would determine the outcome. And this is where the story takes its most important turn. Because the decision, according to the premise of this documentary, was not simply to review the situation, Charles allegedly allowed Anne to proceed. There was no dramatic confrontation between brother and sister, no angry exchange, no public declaration, just a quiet acceptance of an idea that could have enormous consequences for Camilla. But why would Charles agree? Was he convinced that Anne was right? Was he thinking about the future of the monarchy? Or was there another calculation taking place, one involving William, the changing balance of power, and the legacy Charles wanted to leave behind? The answer changes the meaning of everything that came before. And the next revelation is the one that makes this story far more difficult to dismiss as a simple family disagreement. The most surprising part of this story was never that Princess Anne wanted the Parker Bowles family's institutional presence reduced. It was that Charles allegedly agreed. That single detail changes the entire picture. Until this point, Anne could have been viewed as a senior royal acting according to her own principles. But if Charles gave his approval, then the decision was no longer simply Anne's judgment. It became part of a much larger calculation about the future of the monarchy, and Charles had reasons to take that calculation seriously. A modern monarchy cannot afford to appear as though family connections automatically guarantee access, influence, or privilege. Every informal appointment, every invitation, and every association can become a question of public trust when the institution is already under scrutiny. For Charles, the issue was therefore larger than Camilla's children. It was about what kind of monarchy he wanted to leave behind, and that is where William enters the picture. The Prince of Wales has increasingly represented a more streamlined vision of royal life, one built around a smaller group of clearly defined working figures. From that perspective, the wider network surrounding the monarchy becomes harder to justify when its members have no direct institutional responsibility. Anne's position and William's philosophy were not identical, but they pointed in a similar direction. Less automatic privilege, clearer boundaries, greater emphasis on duty. Charles could therefore see an opportunity. Instead of openly confronting Camilla's family himself, he could allow Anne to make the institutional argument. Her reputation for discipline and independence would make the decision appear less like a personal attack and more like an expression of royal principle. That distinction mattered enormously. If Charles had personally removed the names, the story would immediately become about a husband acting against his wife's family. With Anne involved, the decision could instead be presented as part of a broader institutional restructuring. But there was a human cost. Camilla could still see what had happened. Her husband had not merely failed to protect her family. If the reported account is correct, he had quietly accepted the decision, and that creates the question hanging over the entire palace. Did Charles believe the monarchy needed this sacrifice badly enough to risk hurting his own marriage? Because once the decision was approved, the consequences were no longer theoretical. The machinery had begun moving. Once the decision had allegedly been approved, the most dramatic part of the story was also the least visible. There was no grand dismissal, no palace announcement declaring that the Parker Bowles family had been pushed aside. Instead, the consequences appeared in the quiet places where royal influence is often hardest to measure. A name can disappear from a list. An invitation can stop arriving automatically. A familiar relationship with palace staff can become more formal. A person who once moved through royal spaces without explanation may suddenly find that every door requires a reason to open. That is the nature of institutional distance. It rarely announces itself. And for Camilla's family, that may have been precisely what made the alleged change so significant. Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes did not necessarily lose formal royal positions because they were never working royals in the traditional sense. What changed, according to the premise of this story, was the invisible infrastructure surrounding their relationship with the institution. That infrastructure is difficult to prove because much of it exists through relationships rather than documents. A phone call returned quickly. An invitation extended without being requested. A familiar face welcomed into a room. A connection that quietly creates access. None of these things necessarily appears on an official balance sheet, yet together they can determine who feels naturally included and who begins to feel like an outsider. And that is why the alleged removal of names matters beyond the names themselves. It represents a change in expectation. The monarchy was becoming less willing to allow family proximity to function as an automatic credential. For Anne, that may have been the entire point. For Camilla, however, the message could feel very different. Her own position remained secure. She was still queen consort, still beside Charles, still part of the central royal household. But the circle surrounding her had become narrower, and there was another complication. If Charles truly supported the decision, then Camilla could not simply dismiss it as Anne acting alone. The king himself had apparently accepted the principle behind it, so the question was no longer whether the machinery had moved. It had. The question was whether Camilla would accept where that machinery had taken her family. Because one final conversation was still waiting to happen. What happened between Charles and Camilla after the decision was reportedly approved may be the part of the story that can never be fully seen from the outside. There was no public confrontation, no angry exchange captured by cameras, no dramatic statement suggesting that the king and queen were suddenly divided, and that silence may be more revealing than an argument ever could have been. For Camilla, the issue was deeply personal. The people affected were connected to her long before she became queen, and their position within royal circles had developed alongside her own journey into the institution. Now, that connection had apparently been judged differently. The difficult question for Camilla was not simply why Anne had acted, it was why Charles had allowed it. A wife can understand her husband's duty to the crown. She can accept difficult decisions when they involve the institution as a whole. But when that institutional decision reaches directly into her own family, the boundary between duty and personal loyalty becomes much harder to maintain. Charles, meanwhile, had his own dilemma. If he defended Camilla's family, He risked undermining the very principle of institutional discipline that he was trying to establish. If he stood behind Anne, he risked making Camilla feel that the crown had been placed above her family once again. There was no perfect answer, and perhaps that is why the alleged decision was handled so quietly. Charles did not need to stop loving Camilla to disagree with the institutional role of her relatives. Those two positions could exist at the same time, but knowing that intellectually does not necessarily make it easier emotionally. For Camilla, the most painful realization may have been that the man beside her had chosen not to intervene. And there was another presence in the background that made the situation even more complicated. William. He did not need to publicly demand anything. His broader vision for the monarchy already pointed toward a smaller and more tightly controlled institution. Anne's action appeared compatible with that direction, while Charles's approval allowed it to happen without turning William into the visible antagonist. That left Camilla facing an uncomfortable reality. The decision had not come from one isolated person. Different parts of the royal family were moving toward the same institutional boundary. And yet, whatever was said privately between Charles and Camilla, the decision itself remained. The next stage would be harder to contain, because once a quiet palace decision becomes visible to the outside world, everyone begins searching for what the silence was hiding. For a while, the palace could rely on the oldest tool in its arsenal. Silence. There was no dramatic announcement to dissect, and no official explanation that could be challenged. That left royal correspondents and palace watchers with something they understood very well, a gap. And gaps invite questions. Why had the names disappeared? Who had authorized the change? Was this routine housekeeping, or was something much more deliberate taking place behind the scenes? The more closely observers looked, the harder it became to separate administration from symbolism. Royal records are rarely interesting when everything is normal. They become interesting when something changes without explanation. That was when competing interpretations began to emerge. One theory was that the palace was simply tightening its standards after a period of intense scrutiny surrounding the wider royal family. If the institution wanted to demonstrate that proximity alone was no longer enough to justify access, reducing informal connections would make sense. Another interpretation was more personal. Perhaps Anne had finally acted on a principle she had held for years. Her approach to duty, independence, and merit had always seemed stricter than the more relaxed boundaries that can develop around a royal household. And then there was the interpretation that carried the greatest implications. Perhaps this was part of William's emerging vision for the future monarchy. A smaller institution, fewer peripheral figures, clearer distinctions between working royals and relatives. Less tolerance for the assumption that a family connection automatically creates institutional influence. If that was the direction of travel, then the Parker-Bowles family might simply have become an early example of a much broader change. But the absence of confirmation made the story even more intriguing. The palace did not need to deny every theory. In fact, silence allowed each interpretation to grow independently. Commentators could debate motives. Royal watchers could compare photographs and records. Supporters could argue that Anne was protecting the institution. Critics could see the move as unnecessarily cold toward Camilla's family. And the longer nobody explained what had happened, the more symbolic the disappearance became. The story was no longer just about several names. It was about the rules governing who belongs near the crown. Yet, all of those theories still depended on something that could not be proven simply by examining records. The family's reaction. Because sometimes the clearest indication that something has changed is not what people say. It is where they stand, who they acknowledge, and who they quietly stop standing beside. The most revealing moment may not have been a palace statement at all. It may have been a public appearance where nobody said anything, because when royal families stand together in front of cameras, every detail can become part of the story. Who arrives beside whom? Who receives the first greeting? Who walks ahead? Who waits behind? Which relationships appear effortless, and which suddenly seem more distant? None of these details can prove what someone is thinking, but they can create a powerful impression. And after the alleged changes surrounding the Parker Bowles family, even an ordinary royal appearance could suddenly be viewed through a completely different lens. Anne's presence would carry a particular weight. She would not need to make a statement or acknowledge the controversy. Her reputation for restraint means that silence is often the most consistent part of her public image. Camilla, meanwhile, could remain perfectly composed. That would be expected. She has spent years learning how to stand beneath enormous public scrutiny without allowing private emotion to become public spectacle. But composure does not necessarily mean indifference. A glance that lasts a moment too long, a conversation that does not happen, a space left between two people who might once have stood closer. None of these things tells us exactly what happened behind closed doors. Yet together they can change how an audience interprets a photograph. And that is what makes royal symbolism so powerful. The institution depends heavily on appearances, but appearances are never entirely empty. They communicate hierarchy, continuity, belonging, and sometimes distance without anyone needing to explain the meaning aloud. For Camilla, the most important visual message may have been that her position remained intact while the circle surrounding it appeared less secure. For Anne, the message was almost the opposite. She remained exactly where she had always been, beside the institution, not above it, and apparently unwilling to confuse family affection with royal duty. For William, the wider picture suggested something even more significant. A monarchy that increasingly defined itself through a smaller group of working figures, clearer responsibilities, and stricter boundaries. The names that allegedly disappeared from records had become invisible. But the consequences were becoming visible. And once the public began noticing those small changes, the story could no longer remain entirely inside palace walls. The final question was no longer simply who had lost access, it was what kind of monarchy had been quietly taking shape all along. In the end, the most important question is not what happened to the names, it is what their disappearance says about the monarchy itself. If the reported decision was real, Princess Anne emerged as the clearest symbol of an old royal principle. Duty comes before comfort, and proximity to the crown should never become a substitute for contribution. Her position was consistent with the way she had approached royal life for decades. She did not build her reputation through dramatic statements or public battles. She built it through relentless work, independence, and an apparent belief that the institution must remain larger than the individuals serving it. For Charles, the decision carries a more complicated meaning. He could support Camilla personally, while still accepting an institutional boundary that affected her family. If he really gave Anne his approval, then he chose to protect a principle even when that principle created discomfort inside his own marriage. That does not necessarily mean Camilla lost her position. She remains at the center of the monarchy, but the alleged decision may have changed something less visible, the assumption that her family would naturally share in the influence created by her position. For William, the development fits an increasingly familiar vision of a smaller and more disciplined monarchy. The future institution appears less interested in maintaining a wide circle of royal adjacency and more focused on clearly defined roles, and that may ultimately be the real significance of the Parker Bowles controversy. It was never simply about Tom, Laura, or several names on a list. It was about a boundary. Who belongs inside the institutional circle? Who remains there because of duty? And who discovers that family connection alone may no longer be enough? For Camilla, that realization could be particularly painful because the decision allegedly came with her husband's approval. For Anne, it may represent nothing more complicated than doing what she believes the institution requires. For Charles, it may become part of the legacy he leaves behind. And for William, it could be another quiet step toward the monarchy he intends to inherit. Perhaps that is why this story feels larger than the people at its center. Royal power does not always announce itself through ceremonies or speeches. Sometimes it appears as a name removed, an invitation no longer arriving, a door becoming slightly harder to open. And inside a monarchy built on appearances, the most powerful decisions may be the ones nobody announces. Because when the crown quietly changes the rules of belonging, the people who once stood closest to it are often the first to discover that the future has already begun.